Dallas was little and Destiny had not yet been born, nor Delana. And I wanted to get Linda a Christmas present. And so I went up to Southern Hills Mall and, Woodland Hills Mall, and went through the shops and found a rather exclusive dress shop and went through the racks of that dress shop until I found one on sale that I thought would look good on Linda and the right size, and I could afford to pay for it. And so I paid for it, and I took it back and said, I'd like to have you wrap it. So they gave me a little ticket and said, you can pick this up in 2 hours or 2 to 3 hours. And so I left and went up and down the mall to kill time. And so after sufficient amount of time was up, I went back and I said, I came to pick up my wife's present, and I told them my name. But they didn't ask for my ticket. They just recognized the name and said, we've got it all wrapped for you, Mr. Dillon. And they brought me a box that was beautifully wrapped, but it was a lot bigger than a dress box. And they handed it to me, and it was way heavier than a dress. They had given me a fox coat, all wrapped to be, now that would have cost over $5,000. And now, as much as I would have loved to have given my wife a $5,000 fur coat, the dress that I bought was way, way less than that. And I said, I hadn't opened it. I think that there's a mistake made. And they said, well, what's wrong? And I said, this feels heavier than what I expected. And it certainly did feel heavier than a dress would have felt. And they said, well, aren't you David Dillon? And I said, I am. They said, well, that's your package. That was a mistake. Turns out that there was another David Dillon. It really got weird before it was over. It turned out that not only was there a David Dillon, but that David Dillon had a son named Dallas Dillon. And not only did he have a son named Dallas Dillon, but he had a brother whose name was Danny, which is the name of my brother. It was really weird when I found out that his wife's name was Linda Dillon. Well, he divorced her and then married another one, but that was quite a story and a shock that we had such parallels. And so it is that people across the world have called on Jesus for salvation, but unfortunately for them, it was the wrong Jesus. In fact, and this is a hard story to tell, but I want you to listen carefully, that a few years ago there were people that were excavating the ancient city of Nazareth in Israel. And in doing so, they came across the burial ground and a family record of a family from Nazareth that was buried. And among the list of the names of that family, they found that a man by the name of Joseph was buried there. And a woman by the name of Mary was buried there. And the remains of one of their children, whose name was Jesus, was buried there. And these I would call them excavators. That may not be the right terminology, but these archaeologists that were searching out these ruins concluded that they had found the demise of Christianity. What they found was the demise of archaeology. They dug up the wrong Jesus. You see, the mistake was they shouldn't have been looking for Jesus buried in Nazareth. Jesus does have a tomb, but it's in Jerusalem, and it's empty. And I've seen it. You see, a matter of mistaken identity. So someone says, well, I believe in Jesus. Makes no difference if you believe in the wrong Jesus. It is urgent and incumbent upon us that we have faith not just in Jesus, but in the right Jesus. So I want to tell you that the Jesus who I'm speaking about today is, in fact, the Son of God. The Scripture tells us, first of all, that when Jesus was born, in the record from the Gospel of Matthew, that the angel spoke to his mother, Mary, and said that you're going to have a child, and he will be called Emmanuel, which is being interpreted God with us. It was a quotation from the book of Isaiah, and we would find it in the 7th chapter of Isaiah, 14th verse. His name will be called Emmanuel, God with us. This is the Jesus that we're referring to, God with us. The Bible tells us about a man who came from God whose name was John, and he was sent to give record of that light. He was the one that let us know that when Jesus came, he was going to baptize with the Holy Ghost and power. And when Jesus came and made his appearance, asked John to baptize him, John revealed it. Everyone now knew that God had sent John to be the forerunner of the Messiah. And when John saw Jesus, he made the announcement, behold the Lamb of God, who taketh away the sins of the world. There was the sign of the boy in the temple at the age of 12, whose wisdom and knowledge of the Scriptures confounded even the greatest teachers and the doctors of the law, representing for us that this was in fact the Son of God. When his mother said to him, well, son, your father and I have sought you for 3 days, sorrowing. He said, well, why didn't you look for me here? Didn't you know I would have to be about my Father's business? The Bible tells us that when Jesus was in fact baptized by John, not only was John a sign that Jesus was the Son of God, but as Jesus came up out of the water, the windows of the heaven opened, and God from heaven spoke and said, this is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. The next sign came when Jesus went to the marriage supper in Cana of Galilee, his first miracle, when he turned the water into wine. It was a sign that God had come among men. You know, it's one thing to do an illusion that some magician may orchestrate, whereby a sleight of hand quicker than the eye, some object disappears and appears in another place. But we're talking about the hand of God that touched the various molecules that made together the water and changed them from one element to another. The voice that spoke this world into existence was able to recreate the molecular structure of that water until the water became wine. And there was a man, a bystander, that did not know. You know, a lot of times we try to be objective but can't. Those servants would have had a hard time being objective when they saw the water become wine. And they would have said, this is the greatest wine we've ever tasted. But there was one that had the position, he was called the Lord of the feast. He would have been like the caterer of the wedding. And they drew out that wine, the water that had been made wine. And when he tasted it, he said, I don't understand this. Usually people bring out the best wine first, and then after everybody's had a chance to taste it, the less expensive wine comes later. But he's kept the best wine till now. And he didn't even know where the water came from. But the servants knew. And they knew that Jesus was not a man alone, but he was God who had become flesh. Turned the water into wine. He came into another village of Galilee where a ruler of the army from Capernaum sent to him and said, I want you to come with me. I've got a servant in my house. And any moment he may die. And if you come, you can speak the word and heal him. And Jesus said to him, you go right now, and your servant lives. And the centurion returned back to Capernaum, took a day's journey. When he got there the next day, he said, well, your servant's well. He said, when did he start getting better? He said, yesterday, the 7th hour. And the centurion knew that at that moment, 1 o'clock in the afternoon, was when Jesus had said, your servant lives. Jesus went into Jerusalem and there found a man that was sitting near the water of the pool of Bethesda. And he had sat there for a long number of years. Jesus came to him and said, do you want to be well? And he had this answer. He said, I've sat here for all these years, and every time the water is troubled, I get in the water or try to get in the water, somebody would step down in front of me. The legend that they had was that the angel of the Lord would come and stir the water, and then when it did, the first one that got in the water would be well. Now, that's a legend. There's really no indication that ever happened. But the people thought it would, and they sat down there by the pool of Bethesda and waited to see if the water would be troubled, and if they might get in the water and be healed. There's no record that that actually occurred, but there is the evidence that the sick used to stay there at the pool of Bethesda in hopes that it would. This man didn't know who Jesus was. Jesus said, arise, take up your bed and walk. You know what a lot of people think today? That healing is a matter of mind over matter. If you don't mind, it doesn't matter. You think you're well, you're well. But here's a man that did not even know who Jesus was. And when Jesus said, rise, take up your bed and walk, he just did what he was told to do. Crippled man got up, rolled his cot up, put it on his shoulder, and headed home with it. The problem was, there's a problem. The problem was it was the Sabbath day. So he's carrying his shoulder, on his shoulder, he's carrying his bed, doing work on the Sabbath day. And the Pharisees stop him and say, wait a minute, you cannot be carrying that cot. This is the Sabbath day. He said, well, I have to carry it. The man who healed me told me to carry my cot. Who healed you on the Sabbath day? He said, I don't know who he was. I never seen him before. I don't know who he was. But when Jesus revealed himself to him again, then the Pharisees began to persecute Jesus for doing this mighty work on the Sabbath day. And Jesus said, hey, you forgot that when David was hungry and those that were with him went into the temple and they didn't have any food there, they let them eat the bread, the showbread, that only the priest should be allowed to eat. But they ate it because they needed it. They were hungry. It said, one greater than the Sabbath is here. See, these things prove who Jesus was. not just a great man, not just a great teacher, but Jesus was in fact the Lord of the Sabbath. And he had the right to heal even on the Sabbath day. And so after all these things happened, Pharisees came to Jesus and said, Master, we desire a sign from you. Really? You want a sign from the one that turned the water into wine, the one that healed the centurion's servant, the one that opened the eyes of a man who was born with no eyes. He gave healing to the cripple that had no bones in his legs. You're asking for a sign for the one that fed 5,000 men and their wives and their children, 5,000 men plus the wives and children, with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, and now you want a sign? I get that backwards every time. If Sister Heaton was here, she'd say, no, Pastor, it's 5 fish, 2 loaves of bread. That's the right way. You want a sign? Jesus said, I'll give you a sign. I'll give you the greatest sign of all. You take this body and you destroy it, and in 3 days I'll build it up again. And there's going to be no other sign than that. And so they did. They took his body. They abused him. They beat him. He was mocked. He was spat upon. Crown of thorns pressed into his head. With a cat of 9 tails, he was beaten beyond definition. He didn't even look like a human being when he was nailed to a cross and suspended between heaven and earth and died. That body did not even look human any longer. And he gave up the ghost. He said to the Father, unto your hand I commend my spirit. And others took that body down from the cross and wrapped him in sheets and put a napkin about his face and did a quick job of preparing for burial and put him in a tomb and to keep animals away. His burial had not been completed. They rolled a stone in front of the opening because in a matter of minutes from the time he was buried, the sun was going down and the Sabbath would begin. And so they closed him away in the tomb just before the feast of Passover. And he was there for that day and the next day and the next night. But when the morning came on the 3rd day, his disciples came to now prepare his body for burial, but when they got there, they discovered his body was gone. They jumped to the conclusion that his enemies had come and taken him away. The stone had been rolled back, and they found the tomb was empty. Before that evening was over, his disciples, who had been sorrowful, began to leap with joy because he had reappeared. Not in a spirit form, but his body had been resurrected and glorified. They could touch him because he was substance. He even ate fish. What an example he set for us. He even ate fish and proved that he was resurrected. His body had been glorified. His body couldn't be held now by time or space. He was seen on the road to Emmaus and later in Jerusalem. With no time to travel, he was able to make the journey. When the disciples had met in the upper room and the doors were locked and shut and barred, he just appeared in their midst because the walls couldn't hold him anymore. Glorified body. But he was alive. His disciples saw that he was alive. Every one of his disciples at one time gave their life for the testimony that said, we've seen the Christ. He was dead, but he's alive again forevermore. They all gave their life for that testimony. John the Beloved, they tried to kill him. They boiled him in oil. but he didn't die. They put him on the Isle of Patmos. He didn't die, but he was willing to give his life for the testimony that he'd seen Jesus and he was alive again. But I want to talk to you just for a moment about the unbelievers. I want to talk to you about those who said, he's just another man. He's just a teacher. He's just the prophet from Nazareth. They said, show us a sign, Jesus. Jesus said, there'll be no sign showed you except the sign of the prophet Jonah. He said, even as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the whale, even so must the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the earth. And so now when the unbelievers went down to see what had happened at the tomb, they didn't hear a great sermon. They didn't see the sick be healed or the blind receive their sight. They didn't see the water turned into wine, not again. They didn't see the healing of the centurion's servant. What they saw was the sign of Jonah the prophet. Jesus had been 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the earth. But now the stone was rolled away and the tomb was empty. And that was the great sign. In the next 40 days, Jesus was seen by 500 believers. Folks that had trusted him, folks that had been his disciples before his crucifixion, saw him again one last time before he gave his last words of the Great Commission to preach the gospel to the entire world. And in their sight, he was taken up into heaven, and a cloud covered him out of their sight. To believers. But to the unbelievers, he gave only one last sign. That sign is still among us today. You can go if you want to the tomb of Lenin. If you want to, you can go to the tomb of Stalin. Every year, the Islamics desire to make the trip to see the tomb of Muhammad. But if you go to the tomb of Jesus, you'll discover a sign in front of the door. It says, he is not here, but he is risen. And that's the great sign.